Hello and welcome. I'm Maxime Schreier. I'm a professor at Boston College, and I also direct and curate this seminar, the seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jewry here at the Davis Center at Harvard University. I want to welcome you all, and of course, I want to welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Larisa Remennick of Bar-Ilan University, whom I will introduce in a few minutes. I just want to tell you a couple of things about our program this year. I know some of you were at our fall events. We had two very interesting events, and there's a little bit of thinking behind these events. Of course, these are trying times, and in two parts of the world that are connected directly with the topics, the identities, the cultures, and the languages that we explore in this seminar. There wars in Ukraine and in Israel. And I have tried to make some of these connections. So in the fall, we had two really interesting presentations, which you can see on YouTube. One was by Professor David Wolf of Hokkaido University, who spoke on Sugihara Chiyune and the Soviet Union and presented some new evidence. And then we had Professor Claudia Smola of Dresden Polytechnic University. She spoke on Jewish Russian literature and the idea of reinventing the tradition during the Soviet and post-Soviet years, and also in Israel. And of course, today we're going to have Professor Remennick. I also want to tell you that we'll have one more event here on April 17th. We will have Professor Boris Lanin of the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, in Poland, and he will be speaking about the literature and culture of the third and fourth waves of the Russian Soviet immigration. And of course, particularly in the third wave, a lot of the writers whom we often refer to very generally as third wave Russian emigres are Soviet Jews. And I think he's going to try to finally convince us that perhaps the terminology should be changed forever. And now without further ado, I'm really happy to welcome Larisa Remennick, whom I have previously met in Israel and here at the Davis Center, actually at a conference we had here many years ago now on Russian and Soviet Jewry, where Larisa was a speaker. She is a professor of sociology at Bar-Ilan, which is right outside Tel Aviv, and also is just coming out of a visiting professorship of Israeli studies at UC Berkeley. And I'll let her tell you how that was. She is a professor and former chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Bar-Ilan. She immigrated from Moscow to Tel Aviv in 1991. She was at the time an early career social scientist, and ever since has studied diverse aspects of integration among former Soviet immigrants, the Soviet Olim, and their uneasy encounter with Israeli society. Her recent research focus has been on the so-called Generation 1.5 and 2.0 of Russian-speaking Israelis, questions of social mobility and identity dilemmas in Israel. Professor Remennick has authored 3 books in Russian, 3 books in English, among them Russian Jews on 3 continents, Identity, Integration, and Conflict. She's also the author of over 150 articles and book chapters and has been included in the Stanford Citation Index among the top 2% of the most internationally cited social scientists. I'm particularly delightful to welcome you, Larisa, and I am looking forward to your presentation, which is titled Critical Citizenship and Civic Participation in 3 Generations of Russian Israelis. Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you everyone for spending this afternoon with us. You will notice that I've slightly changed the title because I thought that in this kind of audience, maybe it makes sense to make a broader introduction to the topic of my research, which is 3 generations of Russian-speaking Israelis, and among other aspects, I will also talk about their civic engagements and citizenship style, but I will mainly concentrate on the general issues of integration and social mobility. And I think in this group of people, it's pretty well known that the post-Soviet Jewish exodus happened as a third wave, you can say a third major wave of the Soviet Russian-speaking Jewish immigration, which never happened after the foundation of Israel in 1948 because Stalin never allowed mass aliyah of Soviet Jews despite supporting the project itself of the creation of the State of Israel. And then in the late 60s and 70s, with the revival of the Soviet Jewish movement and the détente between the Soviet Union and the West, there was a significant exit of Jews to Israel, the first major post-Soviet communist period aliyah to Israel, whereby a similar number of about 160,000 of Jewish Soviets arrived to Israel and went to the West by the process that is well known as a dropout in the intermediate station in Vienna. But still, it was a relatively small group of people that arrived over a very long period of time. And the mass watershed of the exodus of Russian-speaking Jews from the former Soviet territories happened in the wake of Gorbachev's reforms and the post-Soviet turmoil and instability that propelled about 1.7 million of ex-Soviet Jews to leave in different directions. And this is actually the majority because as of the last Soviet census of 1989, there was about 2.2 million Jews living in the Soviet territories, and about 1.7 million left over the course of 15, 17 years, starting from the end of 1988. Of these emigres who left the former Soviet Union in the process of its demise and during the transition period, over 1 million moved to Israel. The larger critical mass of immigrants became Israelis for the reasons that I will mention later. And slightly under 500,000 moved to the United States and Canada, and about 250,000 to Europe, mostly Germany. So those are the main destinations of the late Soviet and post-Soviet Jewish exodus. As of today, the estimated number of the Jewish post-Soviet citizens who still remain in those places is about 300,000, mostly in Russia and Ukraine. And this is a very elderly community. The mean age is about 65. So basically, the demographic future of Soviet Jewry is quite grim. Just an illustration of those moves, you know, this one is the 70s when people are living on the train, first arriving to Europe in Vienna and then deciding whether they want to proceed to Israel, make aliyah, as was intended in their Soviet documents, because of course they exited the Soviet Union with the Israeli visa. And then many of them dropped out, as we know. And those are the pictures from the 90s and early 2000s when the Israeli direction became a direct flight and much more immediate and also much more massive. Now, when we look at the statistical map of all Israelis who are born abroad, who form actually over 35, close to 40% of all Israeli Jews are first-generation immigrants, and you see that among them, the critical mass, about half are former Soviet Jews. So basically, Russian speakers form the largest co-ethnic sociocultural community in this country. And there were projects of making Russian a third official language of Israel, which never happened, of course, but you know, you can hear it in the street almost at every corner. For those of you who are less familiar with the topic, some key facts about the ex-Soviet Israelis who are the subject of this story. Well, Jews of Russian Empire and Soviet Union, of course, formed the core of the Zionist movement and leadership, and were the main founders of Israel. The Israeli society and culture of the first 30 years of its existence was very strongly marked by the Russian language and cultural influences. And of course, all the names that we meet in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Netanya and every other city mark the presence of Russian Jewish Zionists like Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, Golda Meir, born in Kiev, Chaim Nachman Bialik from Odessa, Zev Jabotinsky from the same Odessa, and so on it goes. So basically, the state of Israel is the political and social projects of Russian-speaking Jews, you can say. But then the influence attenuated substantially over subsequent years, the 50s and 60s and 70s, because basically there was no new aliyah, and the older generations faded away, as always, and there was mass influx of immigrants from Middle Eastern countries, so the population composition has changed, but still, when Russian Soviet Jews started arriving in Israel in the late 80s and 90s, there was a feeling among the old-timers that a comeback of the historic brethren is taking place. And definitely Russian speakers form a critical mass of Israeli Jews, of course, like I showed previously. Also, the younger generations, the generation 1.5, the focus of my analysis, form about 17% of all young Israeli adults, which is a big segment of the population. In some towns of Israel, like what we call geosocial periphery of the country, like remote towns in the north and south, and poorer neighborhoods of the central cities like Bat Yam and Lod near Tel Aviv, the concentration of Russian-speaking Jews can arrive at 50% and more. So there are places where you can hardly hear any Hebrew, which makes a strong imprint on different aspects of the country's life. Now, the important facet of this immigration is very high rates of higher education. Russian Soviet Jews were extremely highly educated community with over 60% of post-secondary or higher education, which is much higher than the rates of higher education among veteran extant Israeli population. And due to this very high human capital, as we call it, the ex-Soviet immigration made a very large and lasting contributions to Israeli economy, education, high-tech industries, culture, sports, and linguistic milieu. At the same time, older age cohorts of immigrants and recent arrivals, and we have a fairly large immigration starting from 2012, the second Putin's span in Russian politics, long-term and never-ending, as we know, with increased rates of political persecution, spearheaded mass outflux, and many of those who left came to Israel, but they are still very marginal and alienated from the Israeli mainstream, whatever it means, mostly due to their very poor Hebrew proficiency and language barrier to this very complicated language, residential and economic segregation. So it's not easy to achieve social mobility in our country. So my analysis is driven by the generational lens of optics in the study of immigration. As I'm a sociologist of immigration, this is my main interest in social research, and I do a lot of comparative studies, also between Russian Jews living in different countries and between different groups and origin groups of immigrants in this country and in other countries. So the lens of immigration is very important in how we see immigrants living in any country today. Because the age and life cycle stage at migration, they shape resettlement experiences and integration outcomes very, very strongly. The adult immigrants who are labeled Generation 1.0 are socialized, educated in their home country, and they face multiple hurdles and barriers to integration in language, in culture, in economic and political domains, so it's not easy to immigrate as an adult person. But probably it's even more complicated to immigrate as a child or an adolescent, so-called Generation 1.5, who were born in the old countries and spent some of their formative years in Russian, Ukrainian, Moldovan, Georgian education system, know Russian and sometimes other languages as well quite well. And then out of the blue, their parents decide that they want to, or they need, or they have to exit the Soviet Union, for example, in this particular case, and to go to Israel, very often in secret and rushing. And for Generation 1.5, it's a very difficult and unexpected and traumatic experience because they do not have a say in the decision. Their parents usually uproot them and move them to another country, and it's not easy for them to integrate. And then children of immigrants born in the host country, the second generation, of course, are educated and socialized in the host country, in the host language, but still experience influences from their parents and home milieu. So you cannot say that the second generation is completely local. It is also influenced by the old country. So, so let's look at specific experiences of the three generations of ex-Soviet Israelis. The parents, the adult generation of 1990s wave mostly, came in this mass aliyah driven by the economic downfall, political turmoil, and panic, mass social panic of the early post-communist transition years. That is, they were mostly driven by what we call in migration research push factors. And Israel was the only accessible destination for most of those immigrants. Starting from 1990, the Western countries effectively closed their gates for former Soviet Jews, stopping automatic granting of refugee status the way it used to be before, and fixing quotas of how many ex-Soviet Jews they can receive every year, mostly those who are reunifying, joining their families already living in America, in other Western countries. So for most rank and file Soviet Jews who did not have relatives in the West, the only accessible destination became Israel. And this explains the huge influx of Soviet Jews in the worst years of the post-communist downfall and economic demise, 1991, 92. While all but few of them knew next to nothing about their new country. Many of them never traveled abroad even, like they never exited the former Soviet spaces. So Israel was their first abroad, and it was a big shock because they did very little about the history of the place, Zionism, and underwent a serious cultural shock with reality that was very far from what they expected, with very different language and culture, very harsh labor market, housing shortage, hot climate, security threats, children struggling at school, you name it. So we speak, when we describe the experience of the first generation of Soviet immigrants, of so-called cumulative adversity, the accumulation of different predicaments and difficulties and barriers in life, because first they escaped the post-Soviet turbulence, and then entered the country that was nonetheless turbulent and actually went into a very difficult period of its history, because the 90s were the years of the Gulf War, and then the Oslo agreements and post-Oslo terrorism, and then the Second Intifada, and then Gaza disengagement, and lost hopes for peace, and the understanding that probably the insecurity is our permanent condition, of which we only learned once again last year. So Generation 1.5, who is my main protagonist and hero in this story. The children of those adults who moved to Israel with their families, mostly, some of them moved with the programs of the Jewish agency, Aliyat HaNoar, hoping that their parents will join them later, but most came as part of their families, as all the children are adolescents, ages 8, 9 to 18, approximately school years, leaving behind friends, secure homes, and basically good life, because kids experienced much less trouble than their parents in the 90s, let's say. Adolescence is a very bad age for immigration, maybe the worst, because it's a crossover of psychosexual maturation, separation from parents, the youth rebellion, with the need to adjust to the new society and peer culture. So those guys and girls experience Israeli schools, which were not very friendly, and need to learn very quickly the Hebrew language and to start mastering different curriculum with very strong focus on the Jewish disciplines and the Bible and Jewish history and Jewish literature, much less focus on the sciences and languages, and also not so friendly reception by the local Israeli kids, who were quite threatened by the mass influx of those very different kids speaking a different language, having very different cultures. So it was a lot of animosity and conflict between Israeli Sabra kids and young Russian kids. So many of those ex-Soviet young immigrants dropped out of high school. They could not stand the pressure of all those, challenges together. So the matriculation rates, the so-called Bagrut, which is an entry ticket into the higher education system in Israel, among Russian-speaking kids in the 90s were lower than the Israeli kids, and lower, of course, than they would have been in the former Soviet spaces if they never left. Because, of course, you can never meet a Russian Jewish child who did not complete high school. This is unheard of. And in Israel, this happened quite a lot. Now, those children had to grow up very quickly. It was very early independence. They also had to help their parents very often to navigate the bureaucracy and to help them with the language and translations, because, of course, the children usually master host languages much faster than the older generations. So quite often we have seen the exchange of roles in the families when children and adolescents had to become guides for their parents, the process that psychologists called parentification, and children become parents for their parents, vice versa. Family relations is a whole interesting, different story of what happened in the Russian community of Israel. But military service, which is mandatory, of course, as you know, both young men and women go for the service, men for 3 years, women for 2 years. So many of the young Russian Israeli men and women could have a second chance while serving in the IDF, for example, for completing their Bagrut, their matriculation, and for getting some professional training in computing, in IT, that gave them a gateway into labor market of Israel later on. The Hebrew improved significantly, and some of them also took the opportunity of conversion classes and undergoing what we call Giyur in Hebrew, if they were not recognized as Jews. So if we fast forward to now, this is a poster of an interesting and important documentary series that's called Generation 1.5. broadcast on Israeli public TV channel 11 a couple of years ago, which presented to the Israeli Main Street the story of Russian-speaking generation 1.5, who are today a very large segment of young Israelis. And after very turbulent adolescence and school years, they mostly managed to set up the right track for themselves. They finished high schools, they served in the army. Most of them, or many of them, over half entered higher education venues, and by now they are married and have families of their own. By the way, more kids than Soviet Jews used to have, because the average Russian Jewish family has between 1 and 2 children in a better case, and now the averages are closer to 3 and even above, because of course the Israeli fertility rates are much higher than those of the Soviet Jews. So the demographics are one positive development in the futures of Russian-speaking Jewish community, those of them who moved to Israel. At the same time, they keep strong ties with parental families, still help their parents in navigating host society, and often financially, because many Russian Soviet Gen 1.0, the adult generation, now retire from the Israeli labor market without having earned really any pensions, because they very often worked in low-skilled occupations and did not manage to amass any retirement savings, and they still have mortgages. So very often the children, Gen 1.5, has to support financially the parents, which is actually reversed from the dynamics in most Israeli families, because of course, Israeli Jews usually help their children to buy their car, their first apartment, etc. So in Russian Jewish families, the dynamic is very often the opposite. An interesting feature of this generation is their sense of entitlement for equality and the drive for social and cultural activism that the parental generation did not show. And here I'm coming to the topic that I advertised about the citizenship and civil activism. So while the citizenship of the parents was very passive and they tried mostly to distance themselves from Israeli politics, their children became much more involved with social and cultural activism, trying to redeem the reputation of Russian Jews, their parents included. And this is another illustration of the presence of the Russian-speaking families, including the younger generation, on the Israeli screen and cultural discourse. This is a recently broadcast series, actually past summer it was broadcast, the series by the name of Sovietska, which is a strange name, that this young lady who is the main hero of the series, generation 1.5, daughter of this family, father, mother, grandmother. This is her brother and his wife. So they're all a Russian immigrant family living in Israel's periphery in Beit She'an. And she moved from Beit She'an to Tel Aviv, and she studies math at the Tel Aviv University, still very much connected to parents and brother. And the dynamics in this family and the issues and problems were in the center of this series that a lot of generation 1.5 and the previous one, my own generation, did not like, because it is based on very, very deeply rooted stereotypes of who ex-Soviet Israelis are. But the veteran Israelis, Hebrew speakers, very much like this series, so it's an interesting gap in perceptions. So the key challenges for Russian 1.5ers. As of today, young Israeli adults of Russian origin between the ages of 25 and 45, now in the middle of their active lives. Number one is socioeconomic mobility, especially for those located in Israel's periphery. Like I said, Israel as a country is typified by very broad gaps between the opportunities in a few metropolitan areas like Greater Tel Aviv, Greater Jerusalem, Greater Haifa, and the rest of the country. The further you are from those major big cities, the fewer opportunities you have for decent education for your children. Schools are much poorer. And of course, the structure of employment is very problematic. There are very few opportunities for educated professional immigrants to realize their potential. And this is also true about the younger generation, who, for that reason, very actively tries to move from periphery to the center. This is the story of this girl who calls herself Sovietska, rediscovering her Russian Soviet origins. She moves from Beit She'an, where her family lives, to Tel Aviv and tries to make something of her life in the big city. This is the story of approximately 30–40% of Generation 1.5 who grew up in peripheral, remote towns, and all of them try to flock to greater Tel Aviv area. This explains, by the way, the huge upsurge in real estate prices and crazy conditions for even renting an apartment in Tel Aviv, because everyone wants to be there. Now, for the less integrated Gen 1.5, the problem is perceived discrimination as Russians that never goes away, and the glass ceiling in their professional advancement, because those who grew up in the periphery very often still have Russian accent. Their Hebrew is not perfect, and many of them have Russian-sounding names and demeanor. So when they're labeled as Russian, they believe that their advancement in the labor market and in all venues of life is stifled. Now, for the well-integrated, those who grew up in the Hebrew environment and do not have any accent in Hebrew, quite the opposite. They often regret their very early and forced Israelization, which they underwent as teenagers, because, of course, Israel is a country with a very strong assimilative ideology. So all the young men and women who came with their parents to Israel had to become Israelis very quickly. They were forced by the forces of, social accommodation to leave behind their mother tongue, stop speaking Russian, stop showing any signs of their belonging to the Russian culture and language, distancing from their parents, trying to persuade their parents not to speak Russian in public places, etc., etc. When they come of age, when they get to their 20s and 30s, very often those well-integrated young adults of Russian origin regret that they were detached from their roots, and they try to recover them, which explains the formation of many organizations of Generation 1.5, like Fishka Club in Southern Tel Aviv, Platform Generation 1.5, and other online and live venues of activism of young 1.5ers who try to revive, to regain their lost Russian Soviet legacies, cultural heritage, and to build bridges between that and the Israeli mainstream, and make their Israeli friends learn and appreciate who they are as people who come from the Russian Soviet cultural domain. So the other issue, which is very important, and it's increasingly important, is mixed ethnicity and tenuous Jewish identity in the country that is increasingly Orthodox dominated. As you may know, Israel has no separation between church and state. And all the matters of the personal status, like marriage, divorce, burial, defining who is Jewish and who is not, is in the hands of the Orthodox rabbinical establishment. So while those young men and women entered, and their families, of course, entered the country legally by the law of return, they were recognized as Jewish citizens of Israel and got, all the documents, and they basically have all the political and social rights as Israelis. But in the domain of private law and personal status, they are deprived of equality because they cannot get married or divorced in Israel, as they're not recognized as Jews. Those of them who do not have a Jewish mother and, for example, have Jewish father or Jewish grandfather, they are eligible for entry and citizenship of Israel, but not recognized religiously as Jews, so they have to get married abroad. And many of them see this as a significant blow to their legitimate status and, legal rights as Israeli citizens. And they try to form all kinds of groups to fight for changing the law or for introducing civil alternatives. Because in Israel, we only have religious marriage. There is no civil marriage in Israel. And there have been fights for establishing civil alternatives for 30 years, for the time that I've been in Israel. The issue has been coming back and forth in Knesset, and it was introduced by all the so-called Russian parties, including Avigdor Lieberman's Israel Beitenu, and it never happened because there is no consensus in Israel about introducing civil alternative to Jewish marriage. And then, of course, there are lingering negative stereotypes of Russian women as sexually available, and a lot of harassment that's still going on since the 90s that spills from the generation of mothers to the generation of daughters, which is yet another interesting story. So I can address this in the Q&A if you're interested. Why?
What's the age of that group?
Which group?
1.5.
Now they are between 25 and 45, approximately. So I'll introduce a couple of studies that were conducted among this group, and we started from ethnographers, from doing interviews and observations in the activist groups of Russian Israelis and all the associations and communities that they built. And we study those processes from the perspective of what we call a reactive ethnicity in sociology, like when you are not accepted and do not feel belonging to the mainstream, very often immigrant children start developing oppositional qualities. They want to be more ethnic than they are supposed to be. This is very common among Turks in Germany, some Latino groups in this country. And so young Russian Israelis also exhibited signs of reactive ethnicity when they did not feel, immersed, accepted, integrated in the mainstream. And so a lot of ethnic cultural entrepreneurs, the young members of this generation who capitalized on those feelings and started building political movements that are trying to mobilize members based on those disappointments and grievances of young immigrants. Now, I'll tell you a few words about several projects that we studied, and this is a good illustration to civic activism and the new citizenship of Generation 1.5, who is not willing to comply with the stereotypes, with negative labeling that their parents were quietly accepting and not resisting for years, right? So this is one project organized by the so-called Fishka Club that is extinct by now, but it was active for about 10 years in Tel Aviv. They organized a series of street weddings, urban weddings, as an alternative for young men and women of Russian origin who cannot get married in Israel, the so-called psulei chitun in Hebrew, that are banned from marriage because they are not recognized as Jews. So this association organized their wedding in the streets of Tel Aviv, in a popular city spot near Cinematheque in central Tel Aviv. They paid for the refreshments and, for the bridal costume and for the music and everything. So this wedding became a demonstration of the fact that this couple cannot get married in the country, and they've been living together for some years because they have two children. If you can see, the children are near them, and they're still not married. One is that's one child, that's the other child. So it's a purely symbolic procedure. Of course, under Jewish law, you cannot get married when you only have children. So it was a manifestation of a protest against the lack of opportunity for a very large segment of young Israelis to get married in Israel. This is another stream of activism of young Russian Israelis. They attempt to build bridges to other groups of Israelis, to other ethnic communities by organizing hybrid holidays. This is a celebration of so-called Russian Mimuna, which is a Moroccan Jewish holiday celebrated at the end of the Passover as a breakthrough from eating matzot to going back to eating regular dough and bread and the pastry. So this, again, Fishka Club in Tel Aviv organized this culinary evening where the chef by the name of Vova was preparing both Moroccan sweet pastry by the name of mufleta, very famous Moroccan dish, and Russian blinches, blini, and there was Russian and Mizrahi music, and everybody was invited. So this was a merger between Mizrahi and Russian traditions, and the ways, the attempts to break the ice and to get more understanding and more common ground between Russian Israelis and other groups of young Israelis. Now, the second generation, they are Sabras, but they're still very often labeled as Russians, born during the 90s usually, so they're today in their 20s, and no longer stand out due to their Russian names or accents because they were raised in the country. But still, the integration journeys are quite different depending of where they grew up. If they grew up in peripheral locations in Israel, in Russian residential bubbles and schools with a big mass of Russian-speaking children and teachers, they are keeping more immigrant features than those who grew up in more mixed or Hebrew-speaking milieu. And this is where the critical mass of Russian speakers in Israel's periphery makes an imprint on the subsequent trajectories of even the Israeli-born Sabra second generation. An interesting phenomenon, those who spent their formative years in the Mizrahi milieu. Everybody knows what Mizrahi means. It's the name for the Israeli Jews of Middle Eastern origin, whose native language is Arabic, who came from Northern Africa, countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and Middle East countries like Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, etc., Lebanon. So their collective pan-ethnic label is Mizrahim, as opposed to Ashkenazim for Jews of European origin, including Russian Jews. So those women and men who grew up in Russian-speaking families in Israel's periphery, where the majority of population is second and third generation Middle Eastern Jews, Mizrahim, very often they tried to mimic Mizrahi habitus and lifestyle to blend in, simply because it was their survival tactic. And as a result, for example, many young Russian, so-called Russian women married Mizrahi men. It's a very common combination in cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, Bat Yam, wife coming from a Russian-speaking family and a Mizrahi husband. So while the generations between Mizrahim and Drusim in the first generation were very, very tense, very hostile, we can say, the generation 1.5 and 2 became much more amicable, and many of them formed families and couples and had children together. Ties with Russian language and culture are weak and already secondhand in the second generation, which is not uncommon in second generation everywhere. Few of them have direct exposure to anything Russian Soviet. They only know what happened there from the stories at the dinner table from their parents. Most of them even never visited the former Soviet spaces, and very few are interested in current events. This has changed somewhat with Russian-Ukrainian war, because everybody is more interested now. Or at least 2 years ago, people were more interested. Now it's become, unfortunately, routine. But by and large, the second generation is quite detached from the Soviet origin. So the Russian-Soviet label is mainly what is called in sociology symbolic ethnicity. ethnicity with very little true content. It's mainly on the symbolic level that they are still labeled Russians. Their civic attitudes and practices, voting, volunteering, involvement in local politics, national politics, is quite similar to that of Gen 1.5, but all the tendencies are moving a little bit to the more mixing in, blending in with the mainstream tendencies. Now, how much time do I have left?
How much time would you like?
I have some more.
That's gonna be my new answer.
Oh, that's very generous. I usually set 2 minutes and you have to complete.
Larry's seriously. 10 minutes, 15?
10 minutes, okay, good. So I'll tell you a little bit about our second phase of our research among younger generations of Russian Israelis. In the first phase, like I said, we did mostly personal interviews, ethnographies, observations of immigrant organizations, events they organized. And later on, we decided to get a more general picture of the trends and statistical means of what happens in the so-called Israel's Russian street in its continued younger version, generations 1.5 and 2. And so we conducted 2 surveys online because this is pretty much the only way to get any information these days from the younger people whose life is mostly online. So the survey in generation 1.5 was in 2017 and in generation 2 in 2021, post-corona year. We have large samples and good response rate. Our samples, despite being internet-based, roughly match the general pool of younger generations of Russian Israelis. The women were slightly overrepresented because women are much more active in social service than men, that's a fact. And higher educated respondents were also slightly above the average for the whole population. About 40% lived in greater Tel Aviv area, which was again a little more than we have in the general statistics. The mean age in 1.5 cohort was 33. In the younger Israeli-born cohort, it was 24. And of course, the second generation was born already in Israel or arrived under age 5. So just a brief snapshot of the findings in those large, more statistically representative communities of young Russian Israelis. What did we find? What did we find in a nutshell, very, very gross representation? So we find continuity in values from the generation of parents to the generation of children and grandchildren. Higher education remains important, and the rates are similar to those in the parental cohort, despite all the hurdles. It's an interesting historical irony because, of course, the parental cohort of Soviet Jews experienced a lot of barriers to higher education in the Soviet Union, and the entry to the best universities and the best, schools of higher learning, particularly in humanities, in political science and diplomacy, in many branches of education that were more connected to Soviet ideology, was practically forbidden for Soviet Jews, or had very, very small quotas, very small representation. So this was the story of the parental generation, who very often had to compromise and go to get their higher education diploma from second-tier, third-tier schools. Most Soviet Jews still got their higher education, 70-75% got higher education in the Soviet Union, the Jews I mean, but very often not in the best schools that were off limits for them mostly. Now their children had hurdles to higher education for different reasons in Israel, right? Because like I said, some of them dropped out of high school because they couldn't overcome all the barriers, social, educational, linguistic, to complete high school in Israel. Some of them completed high schools with a bagrut matriculation not good enough in order to proceed to the universities. So the barriers were mostly socioeconomical. And then some of the parents could not support them through school because higher education in Israel is much cheaper than in this country, but it's not free. You have to pay. And for all in new immigrants' incomes, it's a substantial level of tuition fees. So some parents could not support their children in school. So basically, the hurdles were there. Anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, socioeconomic barriers in Israel, but still most of both generations somehow made it to a professional, educated middle class, and their occupational structure is dominated by STEM. Does everybody know what STEM is? Science, technology, engineering, math, hard skills that are marketable and usable in all countries, of course. Medicine, social services, this is the main structure, and very few go into humanities and soft fields like sociology and anthropology. I almost have no Russian-speaking students. They do not go to those places because, of course, our diploma has very little application on the actual labor market of Israel, unfortunately. So the choices are very pragmatic. And this venue allowed them to keep their middle class locations. Like in our surveys, over 40% of respondents in Gen 1.5, who is somewhat older and more accomplished in their careers, reported higher than average income, which is a very good achievement given that most of their parents lived around the poverty line. And they still help their parents to make it, like I said. So 60% of our respondents said that their living standards in their own families are higher than those of the parental cohort. So there is a positive socioeconomic mobility in every subsequent generation. Home ownership, the blue one, is still a problem, as it is for all younger Israelis who do not inherit a villa or an apartment from their grandparents or parents, because real estate is madly expensive in Israel and going up and up all the time. So about 1/3 of our cohort can afford buying a place of their own. And partly reflecting all those career tracks and middle-class locations and occupational structure, over 50% in both samples, Generation 1.5 and Generation 2, are open to work or study opportunities abroad, and only under 40% say in the surveys that they're sure to stay for good in Israel. They're much more globally oriented, their English is better, and they very openly seek opportunities outside Israel because, like I said, many of them feel that they've reached a glass ceiling in their career track. The issues of Jewish and Israeli identity, it's an important matter, also a subject of activism, like I said, exemplified by city weddings for those who cannot wed in rabbinical courts. The whole of this generation of Russian 1.5ers and Generation 2 are stigmatized as suspect Jews. It's a collective portrayal of Russian-speaking Israelis by the religious and traditional segments of the Israeli society, because indeed 30 to 40% of our ilk are not recognized as Jews by the rabbinical authorities in Israel because their mother was not Jewish. So in our samples, it was about 35% those who are not recognized as Jews. And the last one is again from the surveys. It's all the results of our surveys. Just 45% of those who were married in those samples had the Orthodox wedding ceremony in Israel. And another 45%, almost half, married abroad, and 10% cohabited without marriage, okay, because they cannot be married. The attachment to the Jewish traditions, the green one, In generation 1.5, it was a very low percentage, about a quarter who said that they're really sentimentally attached to Jewish tradition and take them very seriously. But at the same time, 2/3 do celebrate major Jewish holidays, and 80% had their sons circumcised. So despite the lack of sentimental deep attachment to Jewish religion, because they grew up without it still, their parents and themselves, very few of them went to religious schools or completed religious schools. They still believe they belong to the secular segment of Israelis, but as a means of adjustment, of social adaptation, of becoming Israelis, they comply with all the life cycle rituals and traditions and holidays like all the other Israelis. We interpret this as a sign of integration, of social immersion, rather than real, true Jewish religiosity. Although in the second generation, those who reported real attachment to Jewish traditions was high, it was about half. So gradually the process of connecting to Judaism, to Israeli traditions in the religious domain that are so typical of the lifestyle country. They are growing more prominent with subsequent generations. This is the results of a couple of slides and then done. Those are the results of the Pew Center survey conducted 8-9 years ago, which shows even more that subsequent generations of Russian Israelis are progressively more religious, as they define it, or more attached to Jewish tradition than their parents were. The three columns are the first one is parental generation. The second one is second generation. They lumped together Gen 1.5 and second. And the dark blue is all Israeli Jews. So you can see that, well, I find this hard to believe, frankly, but this is what they report in the Pew survey, that 70% of Gen 1.5 believe in God. I don't know about that. That's not what our surveys show. But they light Sabbath candles and they celebrate Hanukkah, and they even half say that they keep kosher at home, which is, again, hard for me to believe, but they say so. And somewhat less keep kosher outside of their homes. But anyway, the tendency is of more compliance with the religious lifestyle. Political and civic locations. Most report positive or neutral views on feminism and sexual minority rights. This is a very contentious issue for Russian Jews, for all former Soviets, because, of course, the classical attitudes of Soviet citizens who were socialized in the Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s are very much anti-feminist and very skeptical or ironic about anything that is non-mainstream in sexuality, about the so-called gender spectrum. So the younger cohorts are much more, compliant with the politically correct contemporary liberal views, at least on the level of expression, and they're much more accepting of women's rights and women's equality and feminism, both as ideology and as policy. In terms of political orientations, again, it's an interesting picture because former Soviets in Israel are known for their political views and voting patterns that are quite much to the right from the center. They mostly vote for the parties like Likud and Israel Beitenu of Lieberman, and formerly Kadima, that was very popular among Russian Israelis, for the parties that represent secular right, not the religious right, not the settlers, but the secular right. This is pretty much what the mainstream of Russian generation 1.5 is. Now, in the subsequent cohorts, there is much more dispersal around this center. Still, about 50% remain in the same camp as their parents. They are right-wing, and they vote parties like Likud. But the other ones are dispersed between going more to the right, even to the several parties, and to the left. So I would say that the political representation of younger Russian Israelis is very much like the mainstream, the Jewish population of Israel in general, even with somewhat larger representation of those leaning to the left. And an interesting tendency is that it's mostly women of generation 1.5 and 2 who are more left-leaning and liberal, which again is in line with the tendencies of political liberalism in other countries, including the United States, because women are more liberal and left-leaning than men in this country as well. So there's something about women that makes them more tolerant and flexible and liberal. The rates of volunteering, participation in demonstrations and all kinds of street protests. I'm usually asked about the participation of Russian Israelis in the huge outbreak of protests that marked Israeli political and social life just before the war. And of course, the Russian younger generations were represented absolutely as their rates in the population, or even more, in those street protests. Those of them who live in the places where the protests took place, because they were mostly in the big cities again, right? So you can say that they joined the mainstream completely. So let us complete maybe with this brief slide comparing the younger generations with their parents. You don't see the title, the Olim of the 90s. So what are the lines of commonality and change? What has changed? So generations 1.5 and 2, and this is my last slide, generations 1.5 and 2 feel confident in their Israeli identity. They are Israelis in all senses and measures. They speak fluent Hebrew. Most of their friends and many of their partners and spouses are Israeli-born, native Israelis. They feel entitled to inclusion and upward mobility and resent the glass ceiling. So the condition of looking down and complying with the mandate of the majority and not reacting to the ethnic slurs that are thrown in your direction. Dirty Russians go home. All Russian women are sluts. This is what my generation heard all the time in Israel. So the younger generation are not willing to comply with that anymore. They get out of their shell and they form groups and movements and platforms to resist this. Their less integrated segment, those who live in the periphery mostly, are prone to reactive ethnicity. They act out as more Russian than they truly are in order to throw it in the face of the Israeli main street. Many recover their Russianness after years of hiding who they are, actually, in the school, in the army, and start seeing their being of Russian Soviet origin as a resource and not as a liability, as they were trained to see it for many, many years in the 90s and early 2000s. Their civic and political attitudes are more varied, but the political participation on the ground in political parties and political movements remain relatively low, like it was among their parents. There are some representatives of younger Russian cohorts in the Knesset and political parties, but they are definitely not represent their share in the population. So the challenges they face are both similar and different from these of their Sabra peers. They're still in a position of an ethnic minority by legacy to some extent. And more of them, vis-a-vis their parents, like I mentioned, are willing to look for opportunities in the West, and they're not convinced that they are prepared to spend all of their lives in Israel. And they have many more resources to transfer to the Western economies, to American market, to Canadian market. There's been a permanent stream of Russian Israelis immigrating to Canada across all those years, to the United States when it's possible on the venue of family unification or getting a job proposal. So this is an ongoing process, and I'm always saying, when I have a chance to speak to Israeli policymakers and those involved in Aliyah, in procuring of the arrival of more and more immigrants from the post-Soviet spaces, that you are very good at organizing Aliyah, but you are much worse at keeping those immigrants in Israel, at the retention of the younger generations who have very high human capital and have opportunities elsewhere. The challenge is to make Israel attractive and home, real home for them, so that they stay and don't leave. Because so far Israel is an open society and nobody locks us in the country, thank God. So the challenge is indeed to make the best use of the younger cohorts of Russian Israelis, human capital, talents, energies, and let's hope that that's what will be. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just moving back closer. So thanks so much, Larissa, and we're going to open up for questions. I just, if I may, make a comment and pose a question. They're not challenges, but just perhaps to generate some conversation. One is, I think what comes through very strongly in your talk is that the Aliyah of the 1990s throws in particularly sharp relief the tension between the law of return, which is defined, of course, ethno-historically. You have to have one Jewish grandparent to qualify for Israeli citizenship. You need not be halakhically Jewish, and the halakhic definitions of marriage and the which will go back to the formation of Israel. I think this is very important, and I think the evidence probably supports it. I would be curious to know, that is to say, there's a kind of hopelessness that comes through, and I think probably we should point out that, of course, there are venues that allow these suspect Jews not to become suspect Jews. They can undergo giur. The question is, however, why don't they? Or why don't they in larger numbers? I mean, look, in my extended Israeli families, there were very liberal family members who married in Cyprus. They were Israeli, they were Sabras. They just didn't want an Orthodox marriage. And that was happening in the 60s and 70s. That in and of itself is not new. What is, however, new is this mass skepticism towards the obvious vehicles that are available. So I'd like to hear you talk about that.
So indeed, the issue of mass conversion into Judaism, Giur in Hebrew, came up with the arrival of this mass amount of people who are not recognized as Jews, because in the post, let's say, 98, 99 waves of immigration from the post-Soviet spaces, about 70 to 80% are not recognized as Jews because they come on the ticket of the grandchildren of the Jews, and very often on the paternal side, right? So Israeli establishment made a huge effort to organize, to procure for mass conversion institutions and venues, opening Giur classes and opening the program for conversions for the soldiers that I mentioned. It's called Nativ, that they can do during their military service on a shorter venue, but still taking about 1 year. But the studies show that this mass conversion never happened. Over 30 plus years of our presence in Israel, about 7% only of those who are not recognized as Jews have converted in the Orthodox line, in the Orthodox procedure. Because the Orthodox procedure is the only one recognized in Israel for the purposes of marriage. For the purposes of registration in your internal documents, you can undergo a formal conversion. And it's available. It's not very common, but there are places where you can study with Reform rabbis in small groups, and it's much more lenient, it's faster, it's more light, than the Orthodox conversion. So some people do that, but it's another 2 or 3%. It's no more than that. Because actually the main purpose for Giur is getting married with a Jew. The problem is that Even the famous Avigdor Lieberman, the head of the Israeli Beitenu party, who's been pushing for civil marriage for many, many years in the Knesset, and they never succeeded. He procured for the law that is called something like civil unions for two non-Jews. From 2010, there is a law in Israel that allows for civil marriage for two people who are not recognized as Jews. And over those, how many, 13 years, it's just something like 500, 600 people who use this venue to get married, because the usual constellation is that one is recognized as a Jew and the other is not. And this is not proper.
How does it prove that they're not Jewish?
Well, there are many ways to
Yeah,
prove
it's easy to prove that you are Jewish.
It's actually not
No.
very easy to prove
No, it's
to make Aliyah.
That's the whole thing.
Well, it's easier. For a male, you can just have a DNA.
No, we don't have mass.
Aliyah.
Thing. It's a myth. It's a
May I
myth.
speak to this because I went through that. To make Aliyah, you have to provide ample documentation. If you are Soviet-born Jew and if you have an original birth certificate that says that you are Jewish, your mother and father are Jewish, the Israeli, what's the organization? The Sachnut recognizes it automatically. For a woman, it's much harder, actually. And it's so please don't assume that the genetic test is like
Actually, a
blind.
big problem is that all the Soviet documents should be the originals.
Exactly.
Many people do not have them.
Exactly.
And the copies are not accepted.
So it's actually not uncomplicated. In other words, you can qualify for the law of return. That's a different procedure.
Yeah, it's a different method. It's much easier.
But it's still easier to prove that you're not Jewish.
No. When you come to, let me tell you what the procedure is. When you want to get married, you apply for the rabbinical court. You come there. For all people born in the Soviet Union, parents and children, there is a procedure that's called bdikat yahadut, the check of your Jewishness. You have to prove that you are Jewish. Beyond papers, they do not believe Soviet documents very often, because people who sit there are rabbis, Yiddish-speaking rabbis, Orthodox rabbis. Very often they require that you bring witnesses who can speak Yiddish, who can confirm that your mother and grandmother were Jewish. You have to take your 100-year-old babushka to bring it to the rabbinical court, and she should speak Yiddish to those people, and then they can certify you. They do not believe the papers because they know for a fact that there were many, many fakes, particularly when we're speaking about the copies and not the originals. Okay, so it's a very humiliating and unpleasant process, and this is one of the reasons why many people who are kosher Jews try to bypass it and not to get married.
But Larissa, it still doesn't answer the question about
the
Jew.
7%.
Yes.
Yes.
But how do you, again, you prove that you're not Jewish? If you want to get married,
You have to prove that you're Jewish, not that you're not Jewish.
but you said if you both people are not Jewish, then you can get married in this other way.
Well, you have your papers in your Taudat Zehut in the Israeli ID says that you are Yehudi, you are Jewish, and then this law does not apply to you.
But what if
It's all
somebody,
documents. Okay, I'll get to that later. Okay, let me finish about the 7%. Why the Orthodox state-sponsored and paid for Ma'arach HaGiyur, the system of conversion, never worked. Because Orthodox Giyur is a very heavy commitment, a very tedious and long procedure. That's end game of that procedure is that you are becoming an Orthodox Jew. This is the expectation. You are supposed to become Baal Mitzvot. You are supposed to comply with all the regulations of Judaism. And the Orthodox rabbinical establishment is very serious about that. They're not willing to make it a joke, as they say. They have to test the seriousness of your intention to lead Jewish life when you complete the conversion process. You have to study for a year. You have to take a course. You have to learn many, many texts and, rituals and traditions. And there is a family of religious Jews who kind of adopts you, and you have to spend time with them. And they come and check your kitchen, that your kitchen is kosher, that you have 2 sinks, and that you have 2 refrigerators, and that you do this and you do that. And then you have to pass very complex exams in the rabbinical court. So it's a trial. It's a very, very difficult, long process. And most former Soviet citizens are not willing to undergo it, especially given that basically they have all the political and economic and social rights other than the right for marriage in the rabbinical court. They are not deprived of any lines of citizenship beyond the matters of marriage. So they are not willing to put their energies and stakes into this process because it's not worth it in them.
So basically, the explanation is mainly rigor. And the obstacles.
Yeah.
Very good. No, that was my hunch as well. But yeah, and then one other question, Larissa. Have you done any work that looks differentially at Soviet Jews by origin in terms of their belonging not to just the Ashkenazi community, but of course, they're Georgian Jews, they're Mountain Jews, and the Bukharian Jews. They're very, very different, and they form strong communities within the broad Aliyah. And two, of course, the perception is that Soviet Jews are secular, but in the 90s, there are some differences as well. And there is a fairly rigorous Haredi community as well. So I'm curious if you could comment about some granularity there.
Yeah. So the so-called non-Ashkenazi Jews of Soviet origin, who are close to what we call Mizrahi Jews, they come from the Caucasus or Central Asia, and those are indeed large communities. They form about 20% of all ex-Soviet Jews who immigrated during the 90s. They are indeed very different from secular, middle-class, educated Jews of the Slavic parts of the USSR, the big cities, because first of all, they were much more protected from Sovietization in those places, and they were much better at keeping their Jewish identity and Jewish lifestyle and Jewish communities. So I would say that the Jews of the Caucasus and Central Asia, the so-called Bukharan and Caucasian Jews, meaning coming from the Caucasus, integrated much better and much faster in Israel than Ashkenazi Jews of Moscow and St. Petersburg and Kiev and the big cities, who were very detached from Jewish legacies for many generations. So I would say that their integration story was not without hurdles, particularly those of the Jews of Caucasus had their troubles with their kids and high deviance rates and whatnot, and problems with young women, whom they tried to keep in a very patriarchal hold because the traditions in the Caucasus families are very patriarchal and they control their young women. So young women rebelled and they wanted to be like their Israeli friends. And so there was many conflicts around gender issues in the Jews of Caucasus. But I would say that by and large, they have been successful and they very often feel much more at home in Israel, spiritually, culturally, than Ashkenazi Jews do. It's true.
Thank you so much. Will you take a few questions?
Yeah.
Please.
I was late, so if you already talked about this, forget it. But can you talk about major differences between Soviet, and I assume when you say Russian, you don't mean just Russian, and all of the
Russian speaking.
Right. Between the immigration of 1970s versus 1990s.
Yeah, okay. I have an article about that, so sorry, not everything. The 70s was a much more Zionist aliyah, because in the 70s, when you managed to exit the Soviet Union, which was very difficult, you risked being a refugee. You risked losing your work and income and social place, etc., etc. So still, when you risked it all and you exited the Soviet Union, you could go anywhere. Every country would have you. And you could have a refugee status going to America or remaining in Vienna or going to France or to Canada or to any Western destination. So those who, under those conditions, chose to proceed and go to Israel, and they did not drop out in Vienna, were usually people with stronger Jewish identity who wanted to live in Israel and not in our place, okay? And this continued for about 5-6 years, from 69 to 74, when the movement when the first window of opportunity opened for Soviet Jewish immigration in the early 70s, those who jumped to take this opportunity were the periphery of the Soviet Jewry, who kept their Jewish identity. Those were mostly Jews of the Georgia, Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Baltic states, the Western and the Southern Jewish communities. And in both peripheries of the Soviet Union, the Baltics joined much later, so they had much of the Jewish life retained there, right? And the Jews of Caucasus, like I said, and Georgia kept their traditions. So when the opportunity presented itself to make Aliyah, they made Aliyah, and they didn't go to America. Some of them did, but in much smaller numbers than those who joined the movement in the mid-70s from the major cities. When Moscow and Leningrad and Novosibirsk and Kiev started exiting in the second part of the 70s, they were the object of the so-called dropout. In Vienna, they said, we want to go to America. Okay, so as a result, approximately similar numbers came to Israel, 160,000, and to the West over this 10-year period. And in 1980, after the Olympics and the invasion of Afghanistan, exit from the Soviet Union stopped. So between 1980 and 88, there were very few exits. So this is the story of the 70s. And since they were driven by the Jewish sentiment and Jewish identity and Zionist ideology, the 70s Olim integrated faster and fuller and more smoothly than those of the 90s.
Even the second
Because
part,
they were driven by the pull factors, the 70s.
even the second part of the 70s.
Yeah, those who opted for Israel because most went to America. That was their selection, self-selection, right? They very often stopped speaking Russian. They learned Hebrew very quickly. Many of them studied Hebrew in clandestine groups and, ulpans for years. So this was their dream coming true. They wanted to make Aliyah, they wanted to live in Israel. So by and large, they were much more Zionist and faster integrated than the people of the 90s, who were mostly driven by push factors, who actually ran away from trouble in the crumbling Soviet empire. And Israel was the only destination that would have them without conditions, right? And many of them did not want to go there and thought that they will spend a few years and they will go further or go back, So many of them never learned Hebrew because they thought they're not staying, so why bother? And so the story of the 90s is very different from the story of the 70s. Also, the numbers are much larger.
What about the children?
The children of the 70s got immersed completely in the Hebrew milieu. Most of them do not speak Russian. And the parents did not teach them Russian. They, like I said, they switched into Hebrew at home, like Eliezer ben Yehuda's family, founding father of the Hebrew language. He forced Hebrew on his family. So this is the story of the 70s. Not everyone, but statistically, this was a very big majority of immigrants. And actually, the major lumps of the 70s are Georgian Jews, Bukharan Jews, and Baltic Jews, Litvakim, Kafkazim, the Gruzinim in Hebrew. Those are the groups that are labeled with their ethnic origin, because ethnicity is very important in Israel. And people never forget when they came, where they came from, and their parents and grandparents where they came from. And so the clusters of those Georgian and Caucasus and Bukharan Jews are still very recognizable in Israel, and they're completely immersed in the Israeli history. So, but if you're interested, I can send you the article and discuss it.
Thank you.
Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. It was wonderful having you here. And my question is more recent about this new situation with the Ukrainian-Russian war. The Jews I know from Ukraine who used to speak Russian are now stuck because I guess my question to you is, how has that changed dynamics between those communities in Israel, and how has the war affected that? And Maxim asked already one of my questions, which was the different groups of people in the former Soviet Union are not all the same. Ukrainians and Russians aren't the same.
Yeah, they used to be very similar. They became very different as a result of the war. Actually, this war has completely redrawn the map of ethnic identities, and it has created Ukrainian nationalism and nation anew, say. Mr. Putin has pushed Ukrainians into becoming a nation, basically. Ukrainian Jews are well known for being Russian speakers. 99% of them used to speak Russian, because of course in Ukraine, Russian is the language of education, of culture, of literature, and the Ukrainian is mostly kind of a folk language, used to be. Right? Despite the tendencies to Ukrainization and to shift to Ukrainian language in administration and bureaucracy and all, but still Russian was a very, very common lingua franca for everyone. The war has changed this, not so much in Israel. First of all, there are very, very few people from Ukraine who came to Israel as a result of the war, either as refugees or Olim Chadashim, the new immigrants. Why not? Because people from Ukraine have entry and privileges in every other place in the world. And Israel is not an easiest place to come and make it as an immigrant. And everybody knows that because, of course, we are 30 plus years behind us. And people know that it's very difficult to make it in Israel. So if they had opportunities to go to any place in Europe, and they had multiple opportunities, they went to Germany, to Sweden, to Denmark, to Poland, and very few came to Israel. It's maybe 5,000-6,000 altogether. And mostly those were people with Jewish family line who already had family in Israel. So parents, children, brothers, sisters, they just joined their family. Refugees were in the order of 15,000 in the first year of the war. They got some help in accommodation and places in hotels and, some help in accommodation and but no Hebrew classes and no work permits because refugees do not get this in Israel. And most of them left very quickly. So we don't have a critical mass of people from Ukraine who are Ukrainian speaking who would change the milieu of the language. So people keep speaking Russian. Nobody speaks Ukrainian in Israel, including Ukrainian Jews who came 30, 20 years ago. And I would say that absolute majority of Russian Israelis are on the side of Ukraine in this war. So, and the language is not an issue. There were several conflicts about inviting tours of Russian theaters or musicians or troops to Israel who are known for their pro-Russian, pro-Putin position, and that was canceled several times. But this is the only thing that I can remember about animosities around Ukraine, because the support of Ukraine is unequivocal.
That and some squabbles in the cultural milieu of Russian Israelis about publishing in Russian and Ukrainian, because there are some bicultural artists, but I agree, those are small.
What kind of role does someone like Sharansky play, who certainly has a high profile here? And he certainly had a high profile in Israel for a time.
Yeah, of course. It's a very interesting life story, very prominent biography. But he's retired now from all political venues and he pretty much completed his career. But he was very prominent in national politics during the 90s because Sharansky arrived in 86, I think, at this exchange, the famous exchange. And 10 years later, in 96, he managed to organize a very successful, first in the history of Israel, party of immigrants, Israel B'Aliyah. And they got 7 or 8 places in the Knesset, which was unheard of. There was never an immigrant-based party in Israel before. So there was a moment in Israeli politics when tensions around Russian Israelis were very strong, and there was a lot of negative stereotyping, huge downward mobility on the labor market, huge unemployment for professionals. So the first generation of immigrants organized and pushed people like Sharansky and Yulia Edelstein and Marina Solotkina and a few other, and Zev Elkin, who are all representatives of this kind of first historic wave of Zionist activists of the 70s and early 80s who at the first opportunity moved into Israel and not to America, because between 88 and 90, everyone went to America, not to Israel. And so he was very prominent as the head of the party, which deteriorated and went down the hill by 2002. They could no longer pass the electoral barrier. People voted less and less for them because they did not meet the expectations. They could not, change the situation, turn things around for the Russian immigrants. So people started voting for the mainstream parties mostly, like Likud. And then Sharansky, of course, was the head of Sokhnut for many years, which again was, he tried to change the very vision of this organization. I think it was under his guidance that Sokhnut stopped writing on its banner that we are working for Aliyah to Israel, but rather the focus moved to sustaining Jewish communities and Jewish life and Jewish continuity in the diaspora as the main goal of Sokhnut, because of course, Aliyah from America and from Western Europe is not very realistic. So he still is a very recognizable face, he is in the spotlight, he is interviewed much, and but now he's writing his memoirs, I think. That's what he's doing.
So I think we are about, yes,
Okay.
but Larissa, I just want to thank you so much for being patient and generous and for all your comments. And thank you all for coming.